Floods are a natural force that no one can prevent or contain. As global warming is rising with each passing day, so is the frequency and intensity of floods. The world has experienced some of the worst floods over the centuries. Some of the clips used in this video are used solely as a visual representation. Stay with us as we take a look at the 5 biggest floods in history. The Yellow River floods were a series of devastating floods in China caused by the overflowing of the Yangtze or Yellow River, the country's second longest river. The floods that occurred in 1887, 1931, and 1938 killed millions in total and are considered the 3 deadliest floods in history. The Yangtze, which has a length of 3,395 miles, is the main river of northern China, which rises in the west of the country and generally flows east until it flows into a bay that opens into the Yellow Sea. The river takes its name from the large amounts of fine yellow sediments that color its water. As the most heavily silted river in the world, the Yangtze has been flooded 1,500 times since the 2nd century. The most destructive of these floods occurred in August 1931, when 34,000 square miles of land were completely flooded. About 8,000 square miles more were partially flooded. In total, the floods left 80 million people homeless. Estimates of the number of people killed by the flood range from 850,000 to 4 million, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. An earlier flood in September 1887 is said to have killed 900,000 to 2 million inhabitants. And the third, on June 9, 1938, caused 500,000 to 900,000 deaths. The 1938 flood was caused by the destruction of the dikes near Henan province to stop the advance of invading Japanese troops during the Sino-Japanese War. The dikes were rebuilt in 1947. The Great Mississippi River flood was the most destructive one in the history of the United States. It began when heavy rains hit the Mississippi River in the summer of 1926. By September, the tributaries of the Mississippi River in Kansas and Iowa had swelled to capacity. On New Year's Day, 1927, the Cumberland River near Nashville towered over the dams at 56.2 feet, a gauge that remains a record to this day, surpassing even the devastating floods of 2010. To make matters worse, 15 inches of rain fell in 18 hours on April 15, 1927. The Mississippi River broke out of its levee system at 145 points, flooding 27,000 square miles. The area was flooded to a depth of 30 meters. The flood caused over $400 million in damage and killed 246 people in 7 states. Arkansas was hit hardest, as 14% of its territory was covered by flooding. As the flood approached New Orleans, about 30 tons of dynamite were ignited on the dike to prevent the city from drowning. Several communities were flooded anyway, but several large levee breaches far upstream from New Orleans prevented flooding from seriously damaging the city. In 1937, the worst flooding the Ohio River had ever seen resulted in covering 60% of the city of Louisville and 65 square miles of Jefferson County outside of Old Town. Around 23,000 people were evacuated, and the losses amounted to more than $1 billion recorded. In January 1937, rainfall began to fall throughout the Ohio River Valley. Overall, total precipitation in January in the areas around the river was 4 times higher than normal. These heavy rains, combined with an already swollen river, caused a rapid rise in the river level. On the morning of January 24, the entire Ohio River stood above the flood level. In Louisville City, the river rose above 6.3 feet. As a result, the river reached nearly 30 feet above the flood stage. The power and water supply failed in Louisville, and it was the most affected city on the Ohio River. On January 27, the river reached its ridge at 460 feet above sea level, or 40 feet above its normal level. Almost 70% of the city was underwater, and 175,000 people had to leave their homes. The U.S. Bureau of Weather reported that the total flood damage for the entire state of Kentucky was $250 million. The number of deaths caused by flooding rose to 190. The flood completely disrupted the life of residents in Louisville. The Ohio River flood led to the construction of the Ohio River Flood Protection System, which took almost 40 years to complete. On June 1, 1889, Americans awoke to the news that Johnstown, Pennsylvania had been devastated by the worst flood in the nation's history. Over 2,200 died, and many more were left homeless. Johnstown was a steel company town of Germans and Welsh in 1889. With 30,000 inhabitants, the city flourished. However, Johnstown had been built on a floodplain at the fork of the Little Conemaugh and Stony Creek rivers. Because the growing city narrowed the riverbanks to gain build space, the heavy annual rains led to increased flooding. In addition, 14 miles up the Little Conemaugh River, the 3-mile-long lake, also named Conemaugh, was held on the side of a mountain by the old South Fork Dam. The dam was poorly maintained. On May 31, 1889, the inhabitants heard a soft rumble that spread to a rumble of thunder. It was found that after a night of heavy rains, the South Fork Dam finally broke, and 20 million tons of water fell down the narrow valley. Boiling with huge chunks of debris, the floodwater wall at times grew up to 60 feet high, racing downhill at 40 miles per hour, leveling everything along the way. Thousands of people had huddled in attics, others drifting on the rubble, while many more had been swept downstream to the old stone bridge at the crossroads of the rivers. Piled up at the arches, much of the debris caught fire and forever trapped 80 people who had survived the first tidal wave. Many bodies have never been identified, and hundreds of the missing have never been found. Emergency shelters and hospitals were set up, and commissars distributed food and clothing. The nation responded to the disaster with a spontaneous expenditure of time, money, food, clothing, and medical assistance. The cleanup took years, and in some cases, the bodies were found months later. It took 5 years for Johnstown to fully recover. On August 18, 1931, the Yangtze River in China reached its peak during a terrible flood that directly and indirectly killed 3.7 million people over the next few months. This was perhaps the worst natural disaster of the 20th century. The Yangtze River flows through southern China, one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. The people of the region, most of whom lived at a subsistence level, who depended on water from the river for their personal and agricultural needs. In April, far above average precipitation fell in the river basin. When torrential rains occurred again in July, the conditions for a catastrophe were created. The Yangtze River flooded an area of 500 square miles. By the beginning of August, the rising water was driving 500,000 people out of their homes. As the water continued to rise in the first half of August and even more rain fell, the rice fields that dominated the landscape were flooded and the crop destroyed. Major cities like Wuhan and Nanjing depended on this rice, and without it, people in the cities starved to death. In addition, typhoid fever and dysentery were rampant due to the polluted river. The millions who died from this flood died of hunger and disease, many after the flood receded. Much of the disaster could possibly have been prevented if flood control measures had been strictly followed. The Yangtze River carries large amounts of sediment that accumulate in certain areas of the river and need to be cleaned regularly. However, since much of the region's resources at that time were dedicated to civil war, the river was neglected. As we have seen this year in Europe and Asia, floods are becoming more common and are often becoming more destructive. When we continue to build along areas like floodplains, Mother Nature reminds us that she is ultimately in control. If you enjoyed this video, then be sure to check out one of our other videos on some of the world's most incredible moments. As always, thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.